Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material, your research, your reports, your notes, and turn it into, well, immediate expertise.
And today we're really plunging into one of the most foundational and I think most volatile states in American history.
South Carolina, the Palmetto State.
It's a state that just carries such a heavy weight of history. I mean, everyone knows it as the place where the Civil War began.
Right.
But then you look at the data today and you find this land of just incredible contrasts.
It's a place where, these deep historical divisions, wealth built on forced labor, a political culture rooted in secession.
Or sitting right next to a cutting-edge 21st century economy. We're talking aerospace, massive foreign investment, auto manufacturing.
And that's really our mission today, isn't it? To peel back those layers.
Yeah.
We need to look beyond the postcard images of Charleston and Myrtle Beach.
Exactly. To uncover the state's really complex geography, its shocking colonial economics, and the current political and infrastructure realities.
We've got a dense stack of sources here, spanning everything from geological surveys on seismic activity all the way to 21st century voter sentiment polls.
And for anyone trying to understand the modern American South, South Carolina is it's the key. Its influence has always been so disproportionate to its size.
Okay, so before we even get to the map, we have to frame this historically.
Yeah.
If there's one statistic from your sources that just completely reframes the entire colonial era for me.
Oh, I know which one you mean.
Most people know the Low Country was built on African slave labor, but the scale of the Indian slave trade there is something else entirely.
It's absolutely essential to understanding the colony's initial economic engine. We're talking about the period between 1670 and 1715.
Right.
During that time, the Carolina slave trade, which was both commercial trading and just direct raids, was the largest among all the British North American colonies.
The number's just staggering. Between 24,000 and 51,000 captive Native Americans were exported from South Carolina in that, 45-year window?
To put that in context, and it's a devastating context, that number is more than the number of Africans imported to all the future U.S. colonies combined in that same period.
Wow.
This was a massive demographic and political disruption. It destabilized huge tribes like the Yamasee and Cherokee and established forced labor as the central pillar of the colony's wealth from day one.
A profound foundation of violence. And speaking of instability, let's talk about the physical ground itself.
Yes.
We tease this, but it's worth repeating. South Carolina is the single most seismically active state on the entire East Coast. The state just seems built on shocks, both historical and geological.
And that physical vulnerability, it really informs our understanding of the state's infrastructure and its planning, or lack thereof. We'll definitely come back to that when we talk about the 1886 earthquake.
Okay, let's unpack this geography.
Yeah.
Culturally, people talk about the Low Country and the Upstate, but geologically, the state is really defined by three distinct bands, right?
Yeah, 3 bands running parallel to the Atlantic, basically slicing the state from east to west.
So let's start at the coast.
Starting at the shore, you have the huge Atlantic coastal plain, and it's surprisingly large. It makes up a full 2/3 of the state.
2/3, wow.
Geologically, it's pretty young material. We're talking layers of sand, silt, and clay deposited over millions of years. This is your classic low country landscape. The salt marshes, estuaries, and the sea islands, those crucial barrier islands.
And it's in this coastal plain that we find these bizarre geological features your sources highlighted, the Carolina Bays.
They are so strange. They sound like swamps, but their origin is something much bigger.
Right, they're not just random ponds, they're these low-relief oval depressions. But the weird part is their alignment.
Exactly. They're all lined up, northwest to southeast. For decades, scientists were debating what they were. Meteorite craters was a popular theory for a while.
So what's the current thinking? How do they all line up so perfectly?
The best supported theory now points to aeolian processes.
Meaning wind-blown.
Right. Wind-blown sand. During the last big glaciation, say 75,000 to 6,000 years ago, the southeast was much colder and drier.
Yeah.
And you had these massive, powerful winds that basically sculpted these depressions from the surface.
So they're like fossilized wind patterns.
That's a great way to put it. They're a constant, strange reminder of a completely different, almost desert-like climate in what's now this slush, humid landscape.
Okay, moving inland, we hit the central region, the Midlands, and the Piedmont. And the landscape just changes completely.
It does, and that change marks a massive geological boundary. You're shifting to much older, harder, rock Paleozoic, metamorphic, and igneous rocks.
Yeah.
But the most critical feature here, historically and economically, is the fault line.
This boundary where the hard rock of the Piedmont meets the soft sediment of the coastal plain, It's like the blueprint for early American city development, isn't it?
It's a perfect example of geography driving economics. Any river flowing from the mountains hits the fall line and suddenly drops, creating rapids and waterfalls.
And that drop had two immediate uses.
Two crucial uses in the 18th and 19th centuries. First, it marked the limit of navigable water. You couldn't get a big boat any further inland.
The end of the line for trade.
And second, those rapids provided easily harnessed water power for mills.
So cities like Columbia, the state capital, popped up right there.
Exactly. Columbia was built specifically on the fall line to exploit both transportation up to that point and the power generated at that point. It was the natural center for early manufacturing.
But water power gave way to other energy sources. So what defines the Piedmont's landscape today?
Today, it's mostly defined by reforestation. A lot of that old farmland has gone back to forest, mostly loblolly pine for the lumber industry. The old textile mills are either gone or repurposed.
And then finally, in the northwestern corner, you get the dramatic elevation, the Blue Ridge region.
That's the high relief upstate. It's a small slice of the state, but it's a complete environmental contrast. The highest point, Sassafras Mountain, is there at just over 3,500 feet.
And that's part of the Southern Appalachians.
Right. The whole ecoregion shifts. You get Appalachian Blue Ridge forests, destinations like Caesar's Head State Park, and the Chattooga River, which is a famous whitewater rafting spot on the Georgia border. It's where you go to escape the summer heat.
The state has these incredible natural rivers. But as the sources note, the biggest bodies of water are all artificial. It's actually surprising that all of South Carolina's major lakes are man-made.
It really is. It speaks to the scale of the 20th century water control and hydroelectric projects, especially by Santee Cooper.
Right.
The biggest is Lake Marion, a massive 110,000 acres. Then you have Lake Strom-Thurmond and Lake Moultrie. These projects completely reshaped the state's river systems and created new inland economies.
So we've seen how man-made lakes altered the hydrology, but let's go back to that disruption we can't control, the grind itself. You said South Carolina is the most seismically active state on the East Coast. Why?
This is such a crucial and often overlooked detail. Unlike the West Coast, where quakes happen on tectonic plate boundaries, the quakes here happen along ancient fault lines within the North American plate. They're called intraplate earthquakes.
And the data shows this isn't just a theoretical threat. While they average 10-15 small quakes a year, the sources note a recent spike.
A big one. 74 recorded earthquakes between July 2021 and July 2022, mostly concentrated around Kershaw County.
But the real reason for the concern is historical precedent, right? The 1886 Charleston earthquake.
That event is the benchmark for East Coast seismic risk. It remains the largest ever recorded in the eastern U.S., estimated somewhere between a magnitude 7.0 and 7.3.
And what was the damage like?
Catastrophic.
Yeah.
60 people died, and 90% of the buildings in Charleston were damaged or just destroyed. It was felt as far away as Boston and Cuba.
So why are these East Coast quakes so destructive, even if they're rare?
It's two things. First, the hard old crust here allows the seismic waves to travel much, much farther than they do out west.
So it affects a wider area.
A much wider area. And second, the infrastructure just wasn't, and in many cases still isn't, built with that level of seismic resilience in mind. If you rarely get a big one, building codes tend to lag.
That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. So the potential for significant damage in a dense historic city like Charleston, which is built on soft sediments that amplify shaking, remains a very serious, ever-present threat. It's the invisible instability beneath that beautiful facade.
Okay, shifting from the shaking ground to the volatile air, let's look at climate. It's primarily humid subtropical, which means those hot, sticky summers.
Right, coastal highs are regularly in the 90s. The only real exception is the Blue Ridge, which has a cooler highland climate and gets a bit of snow, maybe 7 to 12 inches a year.
The state is also clearly vulnerable to severe weather. Your sources mention about 50 days of thunderstorm activity a year.
And around 14 tornadoes on average. But the big annual threat, of course, is hurricane season.
June 1st to November 30th.
With the peak vulnerability being that Cape Verde season, from August to October, when the most powerful storms tend to track toward the southeast.
And what are the storms that have really left a scar on the state's memory?
Well, 3 big ones stand out. Hurricane Hazel in 1954 was a devastating Category 4. Then, famously, Hurricane Hugo in 1989 did immense damage, especially to Charleston.
I remember the pictures from Hugo.
And more recently, Florence in 2018 caused catastrophic flooding. This repeated exposure makes the climate change discussion far from theoretical there.
Let's get into that, because the data suggests South Carolina is expected to suffer some of the worst effects among the Deep South states.
The EPA's findings are pretty stark. While the average temperature has only gone up about 0.5 degree to 1 degree Fahrenheit over the last century, the immediate danger is on the coast.
Sea level rise.
Sea level is rising 1 to 1.5 inches every single decade. That accelerates erosion, increases flooding, and just compromises all the coastal infrastructure.
So the physical vulnerability is immense, but the political response seems stalled. Your sources talk about a 2008 report that laid out some specific goals.
That report was actually quite progressive for its time. It recommended a voluntary goal of reducing emissions to 5% below 1990 levels by 2020. It was a real roadmap.
But by January 2020, South Carolina had failed to develop a comprehensive statewide climate plan. What happened?
Well, the state's political culture is highly conservative and often skeptical of big environmental regulations. The 2008 plan was voluntary, and without legal teeth or real political will, it just stalled.
So you have a state facing this existential threat from rising seas and stronger storms, but with no coordinated top-down strategy to deal with it.
That's the disconnect, a clear physical reality hitting a wall of political inaction.
Okay, that brings us to the second shockwave in South Carolina's story.
What?
Its history. Let's start with the pre-colonial foundation. The region was inhabited for millennia.
Oh yeah, evidence of human activity goes back 50,000 years. By the time Europeans showed up, you had sophisticated Native American societies, the Copiachequi, the Cherokee, the Catawba. Their combined population was up to 20,000 around the year 1600.
But the first European attempts to settle were just chaotic failures.
Utterly. The Spanish founded San Miguel de Gualdape in 1526 near present-day Georgetown. And this is a key fact. It was the first European settlement in the contiguous United States.
And it lasted how long?
8 months. It was abandoned after disease, infighting, and a lack of supplies.
And the French Huguenots didn't fare much better.
No. They set up Charles Fort on Paris Island in 1562, seeking religious freedom. But again, they were too isolated, couldn't get supplies, and the garrison failed. It just showed how tough this environment was to sustain.
So the successful colonization came from the English, who named it Carolina for King Charles I.
Right, and in 1663, Charles II granted the whole province to 8 lords proprietors. The vision was incredibly ambitious, intellectually led by Anthony Ashley Cooper.
Who worked on the governing documents with John Locke.
With the philosopher John Locke, yeah. They wrote the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which had these high-minded ideas about religious tolerance and planned governance.
But those philosophical ideals and the reality of the colony diverged almost immediately.
That's the great paradox. English planters arrived from Barbados in the 1670s and set up Charlestown. And they brought the Barbados slave system with them, which was notoriously brutal.
And they applied it to rice cultivation.
Rice became the dominant crop. It demanded massive scale and specific agricultural knowledge that enslaved Africans often supplied. By 1720, enslaved Africans were the majority of the population.
And this brings us back to that devastating early economy, the Native American slave trade. This wasn't a side business.
No, it was the foundational source of profit. It funded the colony's entire expansion. Between 1670 and 1715, they were capturing or trading for Native Americans from as far away as Pennsylvania and exporting them out of Charleston.
When we talk about 24,000 to 51,000 people exported, we're talking about the deliberate depopulation of the entire region.
It completely destabilized the indigenous political structure. And it created endless conflict, which eventually culminated in the Yamasee War of 1715.
And all that conflict and wealth led the colonists to overthrow the proprietors' rule.
Exactly. The proprietors couldn't govern effectively from England, so the province split into North and South Carolina around 1712, and South Carolina became a royal colony in 1719.
And by the mid-1700s, this low-country region, built on rice, indigo, and slave labor, was one of the wealthiest of all the 13 colonies.
Unbelievably wealthy. And it created this powerful, entrenched planter aristocracy that would define the state for the next century.
When the Revolution came, that aristocracy had to choose a side, and South Carolina became the deadliest battleground in the South.
Absolutely central. The sources confirm it was the site of more than 200 battles and skirmishes, more than any other state. And it wasn't just against the British, it was a brutal internal civil war between loyalists and patriots.
Despite that chaos, they were quick to formalize their new position.
Very quick. First state to ratify the Articles of Confederation, eighth to ratify the Constitution. But the war exposed the great vulnerability of their slave economy.
How so?
Well, estimates suggest 25,000 slaves, which was about 30% of the enslaved population, either fled, migrated, or died. The British offered freedom to slaves who joined their side, which just totally destabilized the plantation system.
Moving into the antebellum period, the invention of the cotton gin solidifies slavery's importance. By 1800, Charleston is the fifth largest city in the country.
With nearly 340,000 residents, almost half of whom 146,000 were enslaved. And that wealth translated directly into political power. The state was a pure oligarchy.
An oligarchy, how?
To sit in the state house, the law required a man to own 500 acres of land and 10 slaves, or 150 pounds sterling. This wasn't a representative government, it was a club for wealthy planters.
And that belief in aristocratic control led directly to the nullification crisis of 1832. This was basically the dress rehearsal for secession, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. The state's political titan, John C. Calhoun, developed the doctrine of nullification, arguing a state could declare a federal law unconstitutional within its borders.
And they tried it with federal tariffs.
They did. They declared the federal tariffs null and void. They were basically daring the federal government to intervene.
And President Andrew Jackson, an SC native himself, didn't back down.
No, he pushed Congress to pass the Force Bill, authorizing military action to enforce the tariffs. The crisis was averted, but the key takeaway was clear. South Carolina's primary allegiance was not to the Union, but to its own political and economic system.
Which meant slavery.
So the election of Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery Republican, on November 6, 1860, was seen as a non-negotiable threat.
A hostile act, as they called it.
Exactly. They believed the end of slavery was inevitable under a Republican president, and they chose war. South Carolina voted to secede on December 20, 1860, becoming the first state to leave the Union.
And so the Civil War began in Charleston Harbor, April 12, 1861, with the shelling of Fort Sumter. But the Union gained an early critical foothold that became a sort of microcosm for the future.
That was the Port Royal experiment. Union forces occupied Beaufort County and the Sea Islands very early, in November 1861. The white planters fled, abandoning about 10,000 enslaved people.
And this became the proving ground for economic freedom.
It really did. Northern charities and federal officials collaborated to manage the abandoned cotton farms, but they organized the freed people to run the farms for wages.
So they were the first enslaved people freed by the Union to earn wages.
Profoundly significant. It was a radical, if brief, model for the economic structure of Reconstruction that was supposed to follow.
Despite that, the war just devastated the state. Over 60,000 soldiers served. 18,000 died. The final brutal act came in early 1865.
General Sherman's march across South Carolina was famously destructive. He targeted plantations and leveled the state capital, Columbia. The state was readmitted in 1868, entering the volatile era of Reconstruction.
And Reconstruction saw this dramatic, radical shift in power.
For a time, yes. African Americans held a majority in the state government. South Carolina sent Joseph Rainey to Congress, the first black person to serve in the U.S. House.
But this progress was violently opposed by white conservative Democrats, the so-called Redeemers.
They used organized paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan to terrorize black and white Republican voters. The violence got so bad that President Grant had to intervene directly.
What did he do?
Under the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, he suspended habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties. His administration arrested hundreds of Klansmen, which temporarily suppressed the violence.
But once federal troops left in 1877, the Redeemers, using groups like the Red Shirts, quickly regained control through intimidation. And the final political move to cement their power was the 1895 Constitution.
That Constitution was designed with one purpose: to permanently disenfranchise African Americans and poor whites to prevent any future biracial political coalition.
And it used things like poll taxes and literacy tests.
Right. Ostensibly race-neutral mechanisms that had a devastatingly targeted effect. By 1896, the black voting population, which had been the majority in the state, was reduced to just 5,500 registered voters.
They were rendered completely voiceless.
And that constitution also centralized power, overturning local government and making counties mere agents of the state legislature, a structure that really lasted until 1975.
Now, in the middle of this dark moment, we find one of the most revealing debates in your sources.
Yeah.
The argument over adopting the one-drop rule.
This really peels back the hypocrisy of the era. Governor Pitchfork Ben Tillman was leading the charge for white supremacy, and a proposal was floated to legally define anyone with any known African ancestry as black.
But the proposal met intense opposition from, of all places, the white elite.
From George Dionysius Tillman, Ben's own brother, his argument wasn't about morality, it was about protecting the property and social status of prominent white families who knew they had distant African ancestry.
He said passing the law would affect respectable families.
Exactly. He argued it would legally jeopardize over 100 landowning families, many of whom fought for the Confederacy, and force them into the legal category of black.
His argument against it was just so cynical. He claimed there wasn't one full-blooded Caucasian in the room.
It's an incredible quote. He basically warned that enforcing the rule would lead to endless lawsuits, scandal, and bloodshed as families tried to protect their lineage and property.
And that pragmatic self-interest won the day.
It did. The political elite prioritized the stability of their own class and property rights over the ideological purity of absolute racial separation. A really chilling insight into the calculus of power.
Okay, moving into the 20th century, South Carolina begins this fundamental transformation. The textile industry starts to grow, but it's accompanied by the Great Migration.
That migration reshaped everything. Between 1910 and 1970, millions of African Americans left the Deep South. The result for South Carolina was profound. By 1930, the state had a white majority population for the first time since 1708.
And after World War II, the state consciously diversified its economy beyond just textiles and agriculture.
The modern economy is almost unrecognizable. The GDP in 2019 was nearly $250 billion, and the state is now defined by globally integrated industries: aerospace, automotive manufacturing, agribusiness, and huge tourism centers.
This is where we see the impact of massive foreign direct investment. South Carolina has made itself a global industrial player by attracting giants like Boeing and BMW.
The Boeing facility in Charleston, one of only 2 final assembly sites for the 787 Dreamliner in the world, and the huge BMW plant in Spartanburg are the anchors of the modern industrial sector.
And the numbers on foreign investment are huge. Over 1,900 foreign-owned firms employing almost 135,000 people. What's the specific appeal?
It's a carefully crafted, aggressively pro-business environment. It's a right-to-work state with a low 5% corporate income tax, no state property tax, no local income tax, and critically, no sales tax on manufacturing equipment.
So they've made it incredibly cheap to set up shop.
They've rolled out the red carpet. But this glowing economic picture contrasts very sharply with the state of public infrastructure and services.
This seems to be the core paradox of the modern state. You attract these cutting-edge industries that need a skilled workforce, but the public education system really struggles.
It struggles profoundly. In 2014, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued this landmark ruling that the state had failed its constitutional duty to provide a minimally adequate education, especially to kids in poor rural districts.
A massive indictment of the system.
It was. The ruling said the state was legally failing its own citizens in a way that just perpetuates historical inequalities.
And nothing symbolizes this failure quite like the state school bus system. This fact is just, it's wild.
South Carolina is the only state in the nation that owns and operates a statewide school bus system.
A fleet of over 5,500 buses.
But here's the detail. The average age of those buses is 15 years old. The national average is 6. Some buses are up to 30 years old.
Without modern safety features, without air conditioning in that climate.
The aging bus fleet is the perfect physical symbol of that centralized structure that dates back to 1895. The legislature controls the money, and they just haven't prioritized the investment to modernize the fleet.
It's a 21st century economy being served by 20th century infrastructure.
Precisely. But despite those K-12 challenges, the state does have a long and diverse history in higher education, which is clearly fueling the modern workforce.
Right, you have the College of Charleston, which is one of the oldest in the country, the flagship University of South Carolina,
and specialized institutions like the Citadel, the Military College, plus 2 major HBCUs, Claflin University and South Carolina State University. That diversity in higher ed is a lifeline for local industry.
Okay, let's look at the people shaping the state today. The 2020 census showed a population of just over 5 million.
Primarily non-Hispanic, white, and African American, but that profile is changing rapidly because of that global economic integration.
The foreign-born population grew faster than any other state between 2000 and 2005.
And the top origins today, Mexico, India, Germany, that directly reflects the recruitment for the auto and aerospace industries. It's changing the cultural texture of the state.
Culturally, the sources highlight the enduring legacy of the Gullah community on the Sea Islands and the federally recognized Catawba Indian Nation.
And religiously, while it's overwhelmingly Christian, that global connectivity has created some fascinating pockets. For instance, in 2010, SC had the highest per capita proportion of citizens following the Baha'i faith.
That's amazing.
It really speaks to these unique global micro-communities taking root.
But then we have to look at the general quality of life metrics. South Carolina ranks 37th out of 50 for overall health care.
The public health numbers are definitely concerning. The teen birth rate is high, the infant mortality rate is stubbornly high. These are markers of deep, persistent poverty that exists right alongside that massive manufacturing wealth.
And finally, the political landscape, which is defined by conservative dominance that really solidified after the mid-90s.
It's a reliably Republican state. It's voted Republican in every presidential election since 1980. It's the only state on the East Coast that a Democrat has not won in the 21st century.
But given the state's long history of disenfranchisement, what does the modern data say about voter access?
The pattern continues. A 2020 study ranks South Carolina as the 7th hardest state for citizens to vote in. The methods have changed, but the effect is similar. A political structure that's resistant to maximizing voter participation.
And we should also note it retains the death penalty, authorizing execution by electric chair, or unusually, a firing squad.
Right.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the tension between that conservative establishment and the evolving population becomes impossible to ignore. We have the results of an April 2023 Winthrop poll.
And this poll reveals the core paradox of the modern Palmetto state. The state elects reliably conservative leaders, but the population is far more socially flexible than you might think.
For instance, a large majority supported legalizing medical marijuana.
And significant majority supported recreational marijuana and sports gambling.
And maybe more fundamentally, a large majority believed the separation of church and state was critical.
Which challenges that historical intersection of faith and politics in the Deep South. But here's the most surprising one.
Same-sex marriage.
The poll showed a large majority of South Carolinians supported same-sex marriage. This is crucial data. It shows that the social values of the average citizen are rapidly outpacing the legislative priorities of the entrenched power structure.
So you have a state with this history of political resistance, from nullification to secession, and a machine that still makes it hard to vote.
Yet the citizens themselves are now demanding major social policy shifts. It means the economic transformation, attracting global companies and diverse people, is acting as an agent of social liberalization, even if the politics remains static.
So the political resistance now is internal. The established system is resisting the evolving will of its own people.
That's it. It sets the stage for a dramatic political conflict in the coming decades. The pressure is now coming from within the state itself.
So we've taken this deep dive from the geological instability of the fall line and the seismic risk on the coast through the appalling history of the early slave trade and the aristocracy that led to secession.
We've seen how that history laid the groundwork for structural failures, like the struggling education system symbolized by that 15-year-old school bus fleet.
And yet, this is a state that has successfully transformed itself into a vital global manufacturing hub for companies like Boeing and BMW.
The tension is just so clear. A political structure that's brilliant at prioritizing business through low taxes and regulation, while at the same time maintaining mechanisms that suppress voter access and resist social change.
The state is now grappling with the consequences of its own success, a population that is demonstrably more socially progressive than its elected officials.
Right. That failure to address infrastructure needs, coupled with the rising internal demand for social change, creates a significant pressure cooker.
So here's our final provocative thought for you to chew on. South Carolina's history is defined by its willingness to challenge federal authority to protect its core system. Today, the challenge isn't external, it's internal. The state is generating a social mandate that directly contradicts the legislative will of its entrenched conservative structure.
What happens when the pursuit of global investment and the demographic shift it causes finally forces the political elite to choose between its rigid historical social policies and the modernization required to serve its increasingly diverse, progressive, and globally connected population?
That internal friction will define the Palmetto State's identity for the rest of the 21st century. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time, stay well informed.